Hello, good morning. So, can you hear me at the back? So, I feel like a bit of a fraud being here, and I saw that introductory bit, and I'm thinking, well, I don't really know enough about what you do, which is a rubbish beginning, really. So I can't think how on earth I'm going to make it relevant. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about where kind of my thinking comes from, and I think at the end, I'm hoping it will have parallels and relevance to what you're doing. Certainly in the way we work every day, I think it does. So, that's the beginning. Right. So, free state. So what I do, and I'm not going to really tell you about what I do, I'm just going to introduce who I am. So, I talk about myself as an experienced architect, which my mother doesn't understand. And I think really, I'm an architect by background, so that's what I studied. But then more and more, I find what I'm doing is I'm designing the experience, which is hard sometimes, because actually we get employed by people who think they want an environment, they want a space, they want a destination, they want stuff. Whereas what I'm interested in doing is it's the energy of how things change over time. That's what I do. So this is a project we did for Sony, and we worked for Sony and Samsung and MTV, and now we do more and more things with property developers. But I find the thing that really connects with people is the designing with time bit. Everything else is just there to support designing with time. Now, if you bear with me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you in 20 minutes a brief alternative history of architecture. Because I find the things that we do when they're most successful are when we fuse in the physical realm, we fuse the hardware of physical infrastructure with the software of programmed experience. But actually when it goes really, really well is when we fuse together all things digital with all things physical. And often that's a terrible mess, but when it works, it's amazing. And often it only works because there's this vision of things changing over time. Now, let me give you an alternative history of architecture. So, if you can imagine, and remember I'm a warm-up act, so this doesn't really need to be kind of perfectly parked on your lawn, so kind of, bear with me. So, 30,000 years ago, that's where I want you to be. Now, my children didn't believe I was coming to talk, because they thought I was just coming to avoid taking them swimming this morning. So, I think you need to imagine that you're 9 years old, so my oldest boy is 9 years old. Now, there was an anthropologist in the early 50s who went to Namibia, and he was there to look at caves, painted caves. This is Lascaux, but it was a cave a bit like this. And he was there in the village talking to the shaman of the village one evening. And the shaman of the village, through a translator, was telling him what this place was really about. Now remember, he'd gone there thinking that he was going to discover the new Lascaux, like a gallery, a painted cathedral from primeval times. But the shaman told him something completely different. Now I'm going to try and explain what the shaman said, but you bear in mind, I'm clearly going to do this very badly. So firstly, those 9-year-old boys, and Freddie was always the boys, were taken to the edge of the village. They were taken to the edge of the village where there are caves there. There are mountains there at the edge of the village. It was dusk. They never normally go to this place. It was a really disruptive collision of a moment. They were scared. They were anxious. They're taken there, then, to the edge of the caves. It's very dark by now. They get low. They go through a small hole into the caves. There, it's all dark inside. They just hear the rhythm of people making a slight rhythmic noise, back and forth, back and forth. They know there's people in there. As they get lower, they begin to see that there's people sitting there in a circle, and they sit amongst these people in that circle. The sound is getting louder and louder. They're encouraged to chant louder and louder with those people sitting there in that circle. Then, a little fire is lit in the center. They begin to see the faces of the people who are sitting in a circle. They recognize them. Then they hear someone moving around on the outside, encouraging the group to be louder, be more adventurous, for the rhythm to grow, to get faster and faster. And then that shaman who's been working around the outside throws a small amount of fuel upon the fire. It gets bigger And at that point, the shaman starts to talk about figurative things, images that those children recognize. Images, ideas of the ibex, of the buffalo, of the hunt. The children can empathize with that. All their games are about that. The rhythm gets faster and faster and faster. More fuel is thrown on the fire. Drink is passed around from person to person to keep them going, because this has been going for hours and hours and hours. More ignition on the fire, and at this point the shaman starts to draw lines between the people around the fire and the cave itself. And at that point we begin to see connections between those people there, the words they're saying, what the shaman's saying, and now, because of the more fuel on the fire, we see the cave, we see the ibex, we see the buffalo, and at that point people say that the shaman would be transformed. He would become that ibex, he would become that buffalo. And after that, nothing would ever be the same again. The children would remember this all their life. And of course, as they get older, they'd then be there in that circle with 9-year-olds being brought in from a new generation. I think it's extraordinary how, well, I don't know if it's the same in your business, but in my world, sometimes I get judged on how many people are sharing, my project, how many people have told other people. But this is something that's been shared for 30,000 years. That's a good number. From generation to generation. And I think that's the thing about experiences, multi-sensory, multi-dimensional experiences that unfold over time. And this is this line that I've kind of crudely drawn over here. This line, the beginning, the point of collision, where those children are so surprised it's so different. Then, getting curious, it's very, they're not sure about it, but they're beginning to connect. The rising energy eventually leads to this point of collaboration, I suppose, and at that point, they're the protagonist in the story. Now, I don't know about you, have you ever seen that film, Darren Aronofsky's Pi? And when a guy gets mad and he starts to see numbers everywhere, I see this line everywhere. And I think, for me, this narrative journey, and, I don't know what example we should better use. We could use the Wizard of Oz, couldn't we? At the beginning, Dorothy, transformed, tornado, takes her to the world of colour, the world of Oz. But then, how curious that place is. She meets her friends, she goes on a journey. We begin to connect with her more, we connect with her because of all these many inciting incidents. At first, she just has to find the witch, doesn't she? But then we connect further because then she has to kill the witch. It's an extraordinary kind of moment of change. This little girl is now the great hero of the story, and nothing will ever be the same again. Now, the narrative arc, we see this everywhere. This has been, people have been writing about this for thousands of years. But I think it's interesting when it's employed as an experience to draw people along. Now, in my quick blast through the history of architecture, let's just try that one out again. So, this is St. Peter's Basilica. So, you need to imagine, and don't worry, I'm not going to do the whole thing for every single one. But you need to imagine that, so originally when Michelangelo first set out this great piazza in front of there, and in many ways this is like the basilicas, the old Roman law courts. It would have an agora, a marketplace at the entrance, which would be so different, so, a place to collide, a place to meet, a place to gather. And then, from that kind of quite collisionable beginning, and you've got to remember that seeing that piazza of all Bernini's angels around there is completely different from the hubbub behind it, all the shanty town of Rome behind it. This would be an extraordinary break in your daily journey. So you open out into this glorious piazza surrounded by angels. That's the point of collision. Then, the door actually into the basilica itself. So this is, and I'm not religious, but I can appreciate the way this sort of machine works. Going through that door, it's very, very low. It's very, very dark. It's very, very curious. You go through that small door, and remembering there's Michelangelo's Pieta there. So, that thing about what are we connecting with? oh, we're connecting with that young mother and her dead son lying on her lap. Right, I'm beginning to connect with that. Then I come into the nave proper. Images, words, stained glasses, all radiating down on us. And we're beginning to connect more and more with that story until eventually, rising up to the great space beneath the dome, we have the altar itself. Everything's kind of risen up, everything's loud, everything's full on. All of the multi-sensory experience is now grabbing us, getting us to take part. And I think it's no surprise, maybe, that beyond that, in this world where we can then kind of champion that story and celebrate it, that's where all the sacristy chapels are at the end. That's where you can give your money. That's where you can take part. That's where you can add to the experience and tell others. So again, I see this same arc again, particularly when we start to look through classical architecture, this idea that the pursuit of the goal and then this new equilibrium at the end. And you often see in section, you begin to see this line again and again and again. Now, because I've only got 20 minutes with you, which it might be too long, we'll see. In an ideal world, we'd spend a whole day getting into this. Because really, what we need to do now is start to look at, I think, jump into the 20th century. Now, this man is a great hero of mine. So, one second. So, I think Walt Disney does a very similar thing, and I think it's not surprising. So, we were talking about a narrative journey earlier, weren't we? And I think it's not surprising that whether we look at St. Peter's Basilica, we see that narrative journey. Now, obviously, Walt, in the late 30s, had this gigantic team working on Snow White. How would he ever bring them all together? The storyboard helped him do that. It meant that every single department, whether you're working on Snow White, whether you're working on the dwarves, whether you're working on the backdrop, you could all work to one storyboard laid out as one narrative journey. And I think, not surprisingly, when you started to look at Disneyland, it was done in exactly the same way. We see this same idea of designing with time. Now, got to bear with me on this one. So imagine this is, so it's 1957 now. No, it's 1955. So you've never seen Disneyland. You've never seen anybody sort of slagging it off. This is kind of a revolutionary place. Now, I don't know, do we have a laser pointer by any chance? Okay, don't worry. So, Walt, he's explaining this place. So the point of collision for him is at the bottom. He's built a station on the side of the freeway. He's built a railway station on the side of the freeway. The railway station looks like something from a sort of train set. How surprising is that? Driving on the freeway, finding a station. Now, you go through the station, so to the point of curiosity. And then as you look through from this building at the front there, this straight line up the avenue, you see Main Street. This is like an ideal version of America. This is like a nostalgic version of America. I've gone through a folksy Toy Town train set, and now I've found a folksy view of it. How strange is that? And yet, that's kind of, I can recognize that. I can see, I know that. I've seen pictures of it. I live on that street. That makes sense. But then, he draws you in the center of his kind of lobster pot, because at the end of Main Street, that super nostalgic kind of perfect version of Americana is a Bavarian castle. Why is there a Bavarian castle there? He's getting you to connect. He's drawing you into the middle. He's like, you've got to get to the Bavarian castle. And there, once you get to the very center, you're right in the middle. You're ready to explore. Whether it's Tomorrowland or Adventureland or Frontierland, you're off. You're in the middle of his lobster pot and you want to collaborate. You want to take part. And ultimately, as you return down Main Street, you want to buy. You want to celebrate with him. You want to champion with him. And in that sense, this is the point where I think that narrative journey really becomes a customer journey. And I think he understands how those two things go together. So for me, that bit, and I think it's like any great department store, isn't it? The first bit, the collision, you open with this generosity amplification, a thing of scale, get my attention. And then I want you to identify with the key story. Keep me focused, keep me in a line, draw me into the middle, to an experience at the center which delights me. And from then, I'm going to happily explore, I'm going to be curious, I'm off. But the whole thing has been mediated by that way he's begun it. He's got you involved in his story, you're the protagonist in his story, and from then on, great loyalty. And I mean, Disneyland is one of the most successful places per square foot in terms of visitor numbers and money made in the world. And I think there's no surprise that exactly that model is what the Wynn, I don't know if you've been to the Wynn casino in Las Vegas, but it has exactly the same diagram, taking you into the middle of Steve Wynn's Lobster Pot. Scary. Right. Now, last one, I'm going to bring it up to date. Now, I think that in many ways, architects, architects obviously, so architects is a sort of physical realm, they like making buildings. And, you can't stop them making buildings. And so it's all very well trying to sort of talk about the idea of this narrative, but really the most important thing is it's about the built form, it's about the gathering of these things. And I think very rarely do we see in these days the idea of designing with time, the idea of the narrative journey. This is Frank Gehry's Starter Center at MIT. And I think it has a similar diagram to the ones we were talking about earlier, in the way this incredibly disruptive starting point. Look at that facade, look at it, it's such chaos, all these collisionable angles. But then, you see that little bit with a sort of a kind of stainless steel fluted chimney? You come in low through this curious place there, and into the student street, which is all straight, linking everything together, getting you to connect. And then you move up into the galleries, the labs beyond, and start to explore from that point. It has a very similar diagram, I think, to some of the things we've seen before. And I think the reason we see that similar diagram, are we okay for time? 5 minutes. 5 minutes. We see that similar diagram. Oh, I'm going to give you time for questions. Okay, sorry. I thought we were going much quicker. But the reason I think we see that similar diagram is it's there to help you collaborate. It's there to get you involved. It's there because they want to give you that great starting point, get my attention, get me curious, but then give me things to relate to, get me involved so that I want to take part. And of course, this is a building where 7 different departments bang together. What MIT wanted to do is get these groups to collaborate. But of course, these are characters that were much happier in many ways, holed up in their labs. They don't really want to collaborate. So the building is trying to bang them together, give them things that they can relate to, and then, through a lot of the unprogrammed, odd spaces, give you room to get together. Now, I think, and I'm not going to talk about that, I think, with my closing slide, I think that, in many ways, what I'm trying to say here is I think the thing about the narrative journey is that I see it as a constant through architecture, but it's not something that's spoken about very much. I see it as the best way to attract and involve people. I see it as the best way to get people to collaborate, because you draw on them on that journey. And I also see it as the best way to create a place of belonging, somewhere that people will identify with, because they've been on the journey. Therefore, they're more likely to be able to tell others. Now, I don't think architects do this very well or very often, but I bet you do. I think this is something probably you know instinctively. So my question to you, even though I've given you no time to answer it, but maybe you can kind of grab me later, is I'm interested in how you might use this narrative arc. I'm interested in how possibly that is a good way, because for me, when I start like this, I can fuse together physical environments and digital environments more easily. Or rather, I can get the team to work like that because they're working under one vision. And I wonder whether you do that too. Because I think if we do, we're going to make cities that are not just smart, but they're really delightful, which would be much better. Thank you very much.
In fact, we do have a couple of minutes for questions if anyone's got one. We have a microphone here that will come and run up to you.
Sorry, I went on. Hello.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when you were talking about the idea of multisensory experiences over time, would you say that that involves aspects of sort of emotional design and prompting emotional interactions as well, to kind of draw people in, as you were talking about?
Yes, I think as much as humanly possible. I think not that we've ever done anything nearly as good as this cave, but you know, what I'm interested in doing is often moments of incongruity with that. That, you know, I'm getting people to almost, you know, there's a feeling of sort of distaste or surprise or sort of anxiety within that, and then we can sort of take them on a journey. But the thing is, never in a duplicitous way. We're always sort of very straightforward. That this is, you know, you've come to, you know, like a bit like a sort of secret cinema project. You've come to take part, and therefore people, you know, behave more warmly towards us as a result. On the whole. Okay. One more question. Hello.
Do you think that this curve, there's many forms of this curve, I imagine, like, I can imagine one that goes up in several steps over time, and I wonder if people get fatigued to that, if you keep going, do people need to relax at some point?
Yeah, I think it's really important that there's lots of pauses on it, you know, that you give people time to reflect. Often these projects we do, you know, that might be a kind of almost a year in the making in terms of that story, as well as it might just be, you know, half an hour of time. So I'm interested. I suppose it's like a fractal thing, how you might see it just in a moment, you know, in half an hour, but you also might see it within a year. But also, you know, I think it only works if you're going to be fighting with people and then clearly you've got to go, okay, now relax. We're not going to just, you know, scare you all the time, which is what I'm doing now. So I think I will let you move on. Thank you very much.